Good morning, friends. Over the past several days, we've talked about what it means to suffer as Christians. Since we are children of God, we are heirs of God, and we are heirs with Christ, provided that we suffer with Him. But today I'd like to return to one of the things we talked about this past Sunday during the sermon. In looking at our Lord's time spent in the wilderness between His baptism and public ministry, we saw that at His weakest moment, when He was literally starving from not having eaten anything for 40 days and nights, Satan came to Him and tempted Him to sin. And we'll look at what those temptations were and how our Lord overcame them this next week during our coming sermon. But we also mentioned that one of the major reasons Jesus was willing to go out into the wilderness was to be tempted by Satan so that He could have victory over Satan. Jesus had to exert and show His dominance over His greatest enemy, Satan. And we went to Matthew 12, verse 29 to help explain this, because Jesus Himself says, "How can someone enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man? Then indeed he may plunder his house." And we explained how that was a reference to the fact that Jesus had overcome Satan, that Jesus had, in essence, come into Satan's own house. He had tied Satan up and tossed him in the corner, and now Jesus was free to plunder all of Satan's stuff, which would be symbolic of all the people that Jesus came to save. At one point, the people were under Satan's sway, but Jesus kicked in the front door and set those people free. In order to do that, He had to bind Satan. He had to put a limit on Satan's ability to interfere. And believe it or not, we see another mention of this in Revelation chapter 20. This is a very popular section of the book of Revelation, but often, as happens in Revelation, often misunderstood. In Revelation 20, verse 1, we read, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that he must be released for a little while." Do you remember a little while back when we talked about how the book of Revelation is broken up into 7 main sections, and that each one of those sections goes back and tells the same story of what happened, starting with Christ's first advent, all the way through the inner advent period, and then to His second coming in glory? Well, here in Revelation 20, verse 1, we start one of those sections again. So Revelation 20 verse 1 is not picking up the story where the end of chapter 19 left off. No, it's going right back to the beginning of the story again to tell it again with a new emphasis and new details, what happened from Christ's first coming, and then as you continue Revelation 20, it goes to His second coming again. But here's where we remember some other things. The book of Revelation is apocalyptic literature, which means it's highly symbolic, highly evocative language, meant for you to kind of see something, to have a picture in your mind. But the point isn't that the individual details each have their own meaning. Rather, to understand these images and the pictures and the vision, of course, that the Apostle John is having, to understand these things correctly, we understand all those details as working together to describe what is generally happening, the essence of what is happening, being used or being described in highly metaphoric language. That's simply how apocalyptic literature works. Because I'm suggesting to you that what we read, what we just read in Revelation chapter 20, verse 1 and following, is describing what happened to Satan at our Lord's first advent. So 2,000 years ago at this point. Christ bound him. Christ limited his ability to do what He wants to do. But then we look at the account in Revelation, we say, but wait, Revelation says that an angel binds Satan and throws him in a pit, and puts a chain on him. How can that be the same thing? Well, that's where we remember, as I just explained, how apocalyptic language works. The book of Revelation is not trying to convey all the details of history. It's simply trying to convey the essence of what happened. When Jesus defeated Satan and bound him, as we hear Jesus explaining in Matthew 12, it's as if He commanded an angel to throw Satan, also described as a dragon, into a great big pit with a massive chain to hold him in place. It's highly evocative language. But we know that picture isn't meant to be taken literally, because first off, Satan is a spirit being. He has no actual physical form. So what use would a chain be in tying him up? So the point isn't to show that these details are realities in and of themselves, but to describe the essence of what is happening. When Christ came, He bound Satan. But then, of course, we might say, well, wait, if you're saying that this happened in the first century, and Satan has been bound ever since, how could that be? Have you looked at the world lately? It seems like Satan is pretty active, so how can you say he's been bound? Well, that's where we understand that Satan was bound in a certain way for a certain purpose. Because Revelation 20, verse 3 itself clearly says that Satan was bound so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. And as a brief aside here, the 1,000 years is not a literal 1,000 years either. That number 1,000 in the book of Revelation is indicative of a long time or the fullness of time, not precisely the number 1,000 years. But in any case, this is where we need to understand the watershed moment between what the world was like before Christ came and then after Christ came that first time. Because beforehand, Israel was the light of God's truth, and that light essentially stayed in Israel. The nations of the world were in complete darkness, basically fully under Satan's control. But then Jesus came. He defeated Satan. He bound Satan in the sense that he limited Satan's ability to prevent the gospel from going out to the nations. And now what's happened? The light of God's truth has gone out over the entire globe. From the first century on, the gospel message has gone out into the world and Satan has been powerless to stop it. That is the way in which Satan has been bound. I had a seminary professor explain it this way. He said that Satan is like a dog that loves to dig up your favorite rose bushes. And so you tie the dog up in your backyard where he can't get to your rose bushes anymore. He can still dig up everything within his reach, so he can still cause a certain amount of destruction, but you have bound him so that he can't get to your rose bushes. It's like that with Christ binding Satan. Satan is absolutely bound, but that doesn't mean he can't still cause destruction within the area of influence that God still allows him. But he can't get at God's rose bushes. He can't get at God's church or the efforts of evangelism that the church has the world over. Now, is Satan still active? Yes. Is he still dangerous to the unaware and the unwary? Yes. Just like an unsuspecting guest that walks into your backyard may not realize that they're standing within reach of the dog's leash, and so that he still gets bitten, Satan can still cause destruction within the realm of influence that God allows him to have. But he is still bound, and he will never overcome God's church. He will never overcome the church's mission. And so know this, my friends. God's church and its mission are like God's rose bushes, and the dog is most certainly bound. Have a good and godly day, and if the Lord wills, I will see you soon.